Good morning, and thank you very much. And first, I must apologize for not speaking in Norwegian. I'm afraid my competency lets me down, and all I can do is apologize, and then blandly carry on as I intended in English. So, at least in the wealthy north-west of Europe, we have some major improvements, I think, over recent years in the way that we approach mental health problems. But we also know that services can and indeed should improve dramatically. I don't feel that I'm in a position to comment on or criticize Norwegian healthcare directly. But in the UK, I think it's worth pointing out that even the independent so-called Schizophrenia Commission, chaired by the very eminent psychiatrist, Professor Sir Robin Murray, concluded that the message that comes through loud and clear is that people are being badly let down by the system in every area of their lives. And incidentally, this doesn't only mean providing services, it also means protecting the fundamental human rights of people caught up in those services. And of course, there have been many proposals for reform. In 2008, Professor Nick Craddock, and as you can see, a whole range of other leading UK psychiatrists argued in the British Journal of Psychiatry that UK psychiatry needed a wake-up call. And in 2012, 4 years later, Pat Bracken and a similarly large group of psychiatrists argued in the same journal, in the British Journal of Psychiatry, for a paradigm shift. What's interesting is to contrast those two calls. So whereas Nick Craddock and his colleagues suggested that, and I quote, "Psychiatry is a medical specialty. We believe that psychiatry should behave like other medical specialties," Pat Bracken and his colleagues argued that, and I quote, "Psychiatry is not neurology. It is not a medicine of the brain." And they argued that good practice in psychiatry primarily involves engagement with the non-technical dimensions of our work, such as relationships, meaning, and values. And my point here is that while I think we absolutely need to reform psychiatry, there are very different views within the psychiatric profession as to what needs to be done. As you can see, and as you probably know, I have my own prescription, I have my own manifesto. And it starts off with an exploration of what it means to be human, really. And for me, I guess speaking as a psychologist, our beliefs, our emotions, our behaviors, including our mental health, are the product of the way that we make sense of the world. And I want to take just a couple of minutes to explain that. So when we look at human beings, we can see enormous variability. We all act in very odd, capricious, emotional, complex ways. The variation in human psychology and behavior is enormous. And psychologists, neuroscientists, psychiatrists have developed many different models for explaining why it is that people behave in these different ways. I've termed it in a paper that I wrote, a complex interactive dance of nature and nurture. And broadly, I think it's worth outlining why we think people behave as they do and why people differ. The default, perhaps unthinking assumption of many people is that we behave as we do for the obvious reason that our brain controls our behaviors. So this is a relatively well-known quote from Eric Kandel, a Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist and author of a very well-known intellectual framework for psychiatry published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. And he said, all mental processes, even the most complex psychological processes, derive from operations of the brain. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Because there are other models. This, of course, implies, doesn't state, but it implies that differences between people, why I behave as I do and why you behave as you do, the differences between us are explained by differences in our brains. And I think that's a fundamental error. Freud famously suggested, and this is just one of many quotes that you could use, that fundamentally, our interesting psychology can be explained in terms of unconscious activities of the mind, and of course, using the interpretation of dreams in order to get there. So that our behavior is explained by these conflicts within our subconscious, our unconscious, and therefore, again, that differences between people should best be explained by differences in our unconscious processes. More recently, behavioral accounts take a different approach. So people's behavior is explained more as stemming from the contingencies of reinforcement to which we're exposed, the rewards and punishments that shape our learning in an operational sense. And hence, by extension, that people differ between each other in their exposure to and their learning from these patterns of punishment and reward. I have to say that I think that for me and for many of my colleagues in psychology as applied to mental health care, we have a slightly different model, which is broadly, as I say, that our beliefs, our emotions, and our behaviors, including our mental health, are the product of the way that we make sense of the world. So there's been an emergence over recent years of cognitive psychology, and the idea that our brains, although our brains are doing this work, our brains are sophisticated learning engines which make sense of and learn about the events that we're exposed to in life. So for me, biological factors, all of those biological factors that we know are important in mental health, environmental factors that shape our world, and the life events or the circumstantial factors, the things that happen to us in our lives, affect our mental health because they shape the way that we understand the world. And this has some profound implications. What it means is that our human frailties and eccentricities, including the things that we talk about as mental health problems, are natural, normal consequences of our capacity to make sense of the world. This doesn't suggest that there is something called abnormal psychology, distinct from normal psychology. And just as an aside, I would criticize my psychology colleagues who write textbooks on abnormal psychology. We don't have abnormal physics. We don't have abnormal hydraulics. We don't have abnormal chairs. We don't have abnormal architecture. We just have the science of the human mind. And it doesn't diminish people's experiences, but I think it does explain them. So if we take Eric Kandel's quote about the brain from earlier, Tom Insel, who is the outgoing, rather frighteningly, going to Google from the American National Institute of Mental Health, said, "No one doubts that the brain is the organ of affect and behavior." And that's obviously true. It is clearly the case that we think with our brains. But I don't think that that is necessarily the same as explaining differences between people in terms of the differences in their brains. I think it's my contention that differences in environmental experiences are vastly more important in explaining differences between people than our biological differences. So to put it simply, I think that each one of us has a brain that has evolved to make sense of our experiences. And those brains are phenomenally complex. It makes sense to understand the way in which we perceive and make sense of the world by and including understanding neuroscientific, neurofunctional processes. But I think that we all have a brain that performs those psychological functioning. And since we've had very different experiences, those equally complex and very similar brains have come to very different conclusions. So as an analogy, and this is an analogy rather than a scientific report, neurocognitive processes clearly interact, in my opinion, with environmental factors to create this diversity of human experiences. So we know that the human brain, as it develops during childhood, is responsible. Neurocognitive processes are responsible for the acquisition of language. And to take Eric Kandel's view and to take Tom Insel's view, nobody doubts that the human brain, as a neurochemical organ, is developing the capacity to understand language. But which language we speak is not dependent on differences in the brain. To come back to the first thing I said, I apologize for speaking in English rather than Norwegian. My brain has clearly processed the information. My brain, and as it developed during my childhood, is clearly responsible for my ability to process language and use it functionally. But it doesn't explain why I'm speaking in English and I should be speaking in Norwegian. And I put this up because this is Google Translate. I should confess at this point that this is a conflict of interest. I own a single share in Google. My son did very well in his high school exams, and so I decided to reward him financially. And I spent the equivalent of about 4,000 kroner on a single share in Google. So I'm now a shareholder in Google to the tune of one share. My point is that our brains are clearly responsible for the processing of information, but differences between you and me, I'm sorry, but there is no difference in your brain and my brain that explains why you speak in Norwegian and I speak in English. My brain is responsible for the information processing, but differences in our brain functioning do not explain the differences in the way we make sense of the world. And we can see this in a lot of science about why people develop mental health problems. So here at the University of Liverpool, there at the University of Liverpool, Ben Barr and my colleagues looked at the impact of the global economic recession on suicide rates using economic modelling. And clearly, there is a relationship between a measurable increase in suicides in England. Similar effects have been seen, especially in Greece, incidentally, but across the Western world, with an increase in suicides tying in with the financial crisis, and particularly with unemployment and threats to people's income. So social and political factors impact on suicide rates. In a big meta-analysis, Neil Risch and colleagues, there are many meta-analyses of the relationship between mental health issues, genetic issues, and life events, and they differ in their results. But in this study, looking at the serotonin transporter gene, so for those of you who know about neuroscience, serotonin is a neurotransmitter intimately associated with reward, with feelings of happiness and positive emotions. And there is a hypothesis that differences between people in the genomic structures underlying the reuptake of serotonin in the brain might be associated with depression. What Risch and colleagues found was that, and it's there on the slide, that the number of stressful life events was significantly associated with depression, but no association was found between the serotonin reuptake gene and depression. And I repeat, there was no interaction between stressful life events and the serotonin transporter genotype and an elevated risk of depression. But of course, the number of stressful life events was significantly associated with depression. And it's not just in depression, in the area of psychosis, for some people, quintessentially madness. Again, we know that there is a significant relationship between adverse life events, trauma in one's life, especially in childhood, and the risk of developing psychosis. So Filippo Varese, Richard Bentel and colleagues again at Liverpool, there have been others, show a significant association between adversity and psychosis. The odds ratio, it's important to note the odds ratio works the other way around. So if you take people who have psychotic experiences, they are between 2 and 3 times more likely to have experienced trauma than people who are not experiencing psychosis. The statistics work the other way around. And importantly, in the Shevlin study, a national comorbidity study, which looked at cumulative trauma, so you would be bullied at school, you would grow up in a poor neighborhood, you'd be exposed to racism, you'd be assaulted in later life. So various traumas accumulating. They found that the odds ratio increased from, again, about 2.5 for one trauma up to 53 for 5 types of trauma. In other words, that if you take people who have experienced who experience psychotic symptoms, they are 50 times more likely to have been exposed to multiple traumas than members of the general population. And to put that in context, I think it's worth making a comparison with the odds ratio of smoking with lung cancer. Smoking is intimately associated with lung cancer, but of course cancer is a multiply determined phenomenon, so both genetic risk factors and environmental effects such as air pollution and smoking contribute to cancer. And for squamous cell carcinoma, the odds ratio of the association between cancer, squamous cell carcinoma, and smoking is about 30. Not hugely dissimilar to the sorts of odds ratios that you find for the relationship between severe childhood traumas and psychosis. And yet, what's our response? Well, if you look at the response to smoking. Nobody doubts that you should have a physical response to cancer. Nobody doubts that we should have early diagnosis and effective medical treatments. But you go to the National Health Service main websites in the UK, and the overwhelming response to the issue of lung cancer is to stop smoking. The overwhelming response to the issue of psychotic experiences is let's pour more money into genetic research. The exact cause of schizophrenia is unknown, but researchers do know that the brains of people living with schizophrenia are different from those undiagnosed with illness. Now imagine if it says the exact cause of lung cancer is unknown, but we do know that people who die of lung cancer are likely to have abnormalities in the way that their genes respond to it. No, we stop smoking for lung cancer, and we treat people for schizophrenia. It's different. I'm starting to get angry, so I shall stop. So what are the implications for the way in which we organize our mental health services? Well, I think that this analysis, from my perspective, means that two things. First of all, it means that we need to do things differently. And secondly, I think it means that we need to embrace the fact that our mental health is fundamentally a product of the way in which we make sense of the world. So my manifesto for mental health and well-being. And I should point out at this point that this is not just my manifesto. I've put down here quite a lot of publications by the British Psychological Society. Again, a declaration of interest, because I've recently been elected president of the British Psychological Society, so I'm going to sell my own works in a way. But I would draw your attention especially to our recent document, the Understanding Psychosis document that you can find at the website understandingpsychosis.net, which draws together quite a lot of this research. And also to my friend and colleague Eleanor Longden, whom you can find on YouTube with her TED talk, and as you can see, 3 million hits. So, yes, I guess being president of the British Psychological Society is nice. It's not quite as impressive as either being Prime Minister or having 3 million hits on YouTube, but I shall work on it. So, my manifesto, our manifesto. Well, first, as I say, we should, the guiding idea underpinning mental health services, in my opinion, needs to change from assuming that our role is to treat disease to appreciating that our role is to support people who are distressed as a result of their life circumstances and how they've made sense of and reacted to them. Practically, I think that means that we should stop regarding people's very real emotional distress as merely the symptoms of diagnosable illness. In my opinion, a simple list of people's problems, if we properly define those problems, should have greater scientific validity and would be more than sufficient for planning individual care and indeed for the design and planning of services. We know part of the background to today's talk is about the recent, now not so recent, publication of the latest edition of the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-5. And that galvanized a large number of mental health professionals from around the world to question the role of diagnosis. Diagnosis is very important, and the reliability and validity of diagnosis has been questioned. And it's important because that flawed approach, in my opinion, to the identification of people's problems is the gatekeeper and the entry point into the system. I think we're making some progress here. This is the cover of the British Medical Journal that I tore off my colleague's copy and framed and put on my wall at the office in Liverpool. When we were discussing the publication of DSM-5, we felt, myself and my colleagues, that what we wanted to do is bring the attention to the world's media that there was controversy over this issue. And we seem to have achieved this. I think it's very common for medical professionals, indeed a lot of psychologists. I would hold my hand up that clinical psychologists around the world are just as flawed in this approach as my psychiatric colleagues, possibly more so in many places, and also by journalists, that the assumption is that when people are acting in distressing ways, there must be something physically wrong with them, that there must be a disease. And you even find the idea of, why is this person hearing voices? Well, because she has schizophrenia. How do we know she has schizophrenia? Because she's hearing voices. And people seem to fail to understand the illogicality of it. Maybe people should study Aristotle at university. But this BMJ cover illustrates, I think, how far mainstream doctors despair at the illogicality of psychiatric diagnosis. But my favourite response to this, and an idea that we're making some progress, I think, here, is here from episode 12 of series 25 of The Simpsons, where Bart befriends a kid called Diggs, who the iconography here is interesting because there is a very famous English film called Kes, where a very strange young boy, his only friend is a kestrel. And so when they had Daniel Radcliffe voicing Diggs with a kestrel on his arm in a Simpsons program, there are all sorts of hidden messages here. But Diggs is interesting to Bart because he's crazy. And at one point, Bart asks whether the rumours of Diggs' formal psychiatric history are true or not. And Diggs replies, "The rumours of my bonkitude have been greatly exaggerated. DSM-5 indicates paranoid schizophrenia, but that work is mired in controversy." Mired. And I sit here and I think I've achieved all I need to achieve in life. So what do we do instead? Well, I would draw your attention to this. This only exists as a Twitter handle. It's by a rather wonderful NHS chaplain called Mirabai Swingler, who works as a chaplain, as a religious supporter in a North London mental health trust. And she talks about only us. So she asks the question, there's them and there's us. We are well, happy and safe. They are mentally ill and dangerous. Is this really true? Or is the uncomfortable truth that there's a continuum, a scale along which we all slide back and forth during our lives? Sometimes happy, occasionally depressed or very anxious, mostly well-balanced, but with moody moments, usually in touch with reality, but at times detached or even psychotic. When we separate ourselves and imagine humanity divided into two different groups, we hurt those labelled as sick, ill, even mad. We allow stigma, prejudice and exclusion to ruin potentially good and creative lives, but we also hurt ourselves because we stress ourselves out with false smiles and the suppression of our own vulnerabilities. There is no them and us, there's only us. And I think that's right. Not yet. Am I running out of time? Well, exactly, 4 minutes. I have 4 more slides. We're there. But then what do we do? Well, one of the things that we need to do, I think, is we need to radically reduce the use of medication. We need to use it pragmatically rather than presenting it as a treatment. And here I would turn to my friend and colleague, Joanna Moncrief, who's a practicing frontline psychiatrist. She talks about the idea that psychiatric drugs are psychoactive substances. She says, like alcohol and heroin. And these substances modify the brain functions, and by doing so produce alterations in thinking, feelings, and behavior. But they don't do this by normalizing brain functioning. They do this simply by having the effects on the brain that we know about. And therefore, for me, although I can see the role of medication in mental health care, I think we need to use it pragmatically and indeed short-term, rather than presenting it as treatment. We also need to tailor our help to each person's unique and complex needs. And this is difficult because people don't come in neat boxes. And I know that today, one of the things that we're talking about is the idea of targets and deadlines and structures for the delivery of mental health services, the packet stream idea. And in the UK, we do have clinical guidelines, and those clinical guidelines detail what interventions have been identified as effective. And they have clear targets for the nature and the delivery of those interventions. Incidentally, I think that this is all good because it means that users of mental health services have more power to demand that they are given the sorts of services that have been recommended as effective in their care. And I think that they can be designed and they can be specified in ways that follow decent science. But that's not the same as relying on a methodology of diagnosis. So if somebody has experienced significant trauma, maybe they've been on military service, I think it's perfectly responsible to understand what sort of help is effective in those circumstances and what they should expect. If people are distressed by hearing voices or if people are paranoid, again, we can not only ensure that people receive help, but we can specify what sort of help tends to be effective for those type of problems. If somebody is depressed or feeling suicidal, if somebody is harming themselves, then we can specify the most effective interventions. We can set demanding targets, but we don't have to rely on diagnosis. And just as an example, if my daughter were to cut herself, I would absolutely want her to receive help rapidly, and I'd want that help to be based on good science as to what helps when people self-harm. But I don't want her to be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and then treated for it. I want people to identify the fact that she's distressed, specify the nature of her distress and the things that she's doing, and then choose those interventions that are most effective for her particular problems. And I would be very alarmed if my daughter were diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Not because I have anything against the diagnosis, but I think that you'd be missing the point. We need to be specific about what people's problems are. Finally, or near finally, we need to offer care rather than coercion. For me, I would encourage people to be looked after in safe residential units that are based on a social rather than a medical model. I don't believe that people are ill, but I believe people are at risk, and therefore I would base my decisions on a well-staffed, safe, even physically safe unit, but on a social rather than a medical model. And in those instances where we need compulsory detention, I believe that decisions should be made not on the basis of whether somebody is ill or not, but on the basis of their capacity to make decisions about their own care. If somebody is able to make decisions about their own care, then those decisions should be respected, and we should only intervene with compulsion if people are unable to make decisions for themselves. Clearly, that has implications for the nature of mental health teams, and for me, I think that we should see a much greater reliance on family doctors, general practitioners, community-based care teams where physicians, primarily from the primary care world, offer medical support to those teams. And for those psychiatrists in the audience, yes, I do think that we should see the right place for mental health care in the community as part of the holistic care of citizens rather than a dissociated medical specialty. So I believe that our approach to mental health care should be different. For me, that means that we should look to local government rather than health systems as the natural home for these sorts of places. I put up that picture of a giant doll because there was a street entertainment put on by the City of Liverpool at massive expense, and I point out that not all local authority provisions are dull and uninteresting. Some of them are quite fantastic and innovative. And finally, we have to establish the social prerequisites for genuine mental health and well-being. And unfortunately, this speaks to the responsibility of prime ministers. We need to look at bullying, we need to look at promoting human rights, we need a tolerant and accepting society, we need to look at unemployment and poverty, social inequity, and the way in which we especially treat people who are different, vulnerable, and behave in unusual ways. And that is a challenge not only for mental health services, but for wider society. And this is the cue for me to stop. I'll leave you with something which strangely echoes what the Prime Minister said earlier, if Google translates her words appropriately, which is a quote by a colleague of mine, Jackie Dillon, who herself has used mental health services and is a strong campaigner in the UK. And thinking about the mass media campaign, and we were thinking about what we would want as the advert on buses. And this is her statement, which is, don't ask me what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me. And at that point, I shall say, thank you very much.